What's up, guys? This is Heiss, and today we are at the East Broad Top Railroad in Rockhill Furnace, Pennsylvania. Joining me today is Jonathan Smith. Jonathan works for the railroad. Jonathan, what's your title?
I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing, but we all wear a lot of hats around here.
As is the nature of preservation of the railroad.
That's right.
Well, why don't we get into it and go take a look at the station here?
Absolutely. It's probably the most recognizable landmark of the EBT. It's the headquarters of the railroad. It's a beautiful building. So it served as the operating headquarters for the railroad. Of course, the railroad actually had its headquarters in Philadelphia.
Right.
There was a whole office floor dedicated to the East Broad Top Railroad and Coal Company.
Okay.
But it was the post office for Rockhill Furnace. It was the headquarters for the railroad. Station agent was here. Train master was here. Baggage room was here.
So sort of anyone who is head of operations, in charge of operations, seeing things happen day to day on the railroad for the last 100+ years has been here.
It is still our office. It's still our headquarters. And while my lower back would really like to have a modern office chair, all of the chairs we're sitting in have probably been here for Lord knows how long.
That's awesome.
Yes. A lot of people, so on social media, I run the railroad's Facebook account, right?
Right.
And I use Rockhill Furnace and Orbisonia interchangeably.
Okay.
Orbisonia is across the river.
Right.
That was the original borough. And we are in Rockhill Furnace, which was the company town for the Rockhill Iron Furnace, right?
Ah.
And so this is the Orbisonia station, but it sits
in Rockhill
Furnace.
Okay.
And that's because there were actually, I think, 2 or 3 other Rockhills in Pennsylvania, and freight was getting lost, baggage was getting lost, mail was getting lost. So to stop any confusion, this was always the Orbisonia station, but it was home to the Rockhill post office. Just one of those many EBT-isms that are confusing.
One of those little details of those little things that you don't think makes a huge difference, but ends up messing with delivery of mail or freight or whatever.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it still is confusing today because if you use Apple Maps, you have to be literal. You have to put in Rockhill Furnace to get you here. Orbisonia will take you to the stoplight over at the other side, and there is no train there. Of course, I tell people on the phone, they say, well, I know where the railroad is. I say, if you see another East Broad Top station in town, I don't know who they are. So go to the one that has the tracks in front of it. You'll be fine.
Yes, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely put in Rockhill, Pennsylvania for the weather, checking the weather in advance, and was very confused.
Interestingly, also, there's a town south of here, Broad Top City, which never was home to the East Broad Top Railroad never went to Broad Top City. The standard gauge Huntington and Broad Top served Broad Top City.
Because Broad Top is a mountain, yes?
Broad Top is a mountain. It's a big table, basically, and it's home to the coal fields. Very large bituminous coal field. And the East Broad Top served the east side of Broad Top Mountain. The Huntington and Broad Top served the west side.
Okay.
And if you just type in Broad Top to your GPS, it will take you to Broad Top City. And a lot of people call and they say, we're trying to find the train station. I'm like, oh, you're about half an hour away.
There isn't one.
There isn't one, I'm so sorry.
So Jonathan, one of the things that I've always heard about the East Broad Top, and I'm only sort of getting a flavor of it after being here all weekend, is that the railroad is almost entirely complete. The structures, the company buildings, the everything is all still here and still being restored or preserved. And I've yet to kind of take a look at what that really means. I see a bunch of buildings and I go, okay, well, these look railroady, but I don't know the function. So we're here by the freight office.
So I start every tour with a quote from Smithsonian Transportation curator William Withoon.
Okay.
And in 1988, he said that the East Broad Top is an incomparable national treasure. And he went on to say that nowhere else in North America does such a complete and original industrial heritage site exist. And that about sums it up. Nobody can be more eloquent than that.
I was going to say, if you needed a brilliant quote from a great source from the Smithsonian.
That's right.
Oh my goodness.
And at the heart of that quote, what he really means is that when you stand here and you look at the shop complex and you get rid of the cars in the parking lot and some of the more modern lights that have been put in, you really don't know what year it is. And it's certainly not 2023, it's 1923. And it looks as though in the shop complex, the gentlemen who were working in there just put their tools down for lunch, walked out, and they're letting me take you through it while they're at lunch. is really the whole aesthetic that we're going for here. And we don't have to go far to really make it feel that way. I also preface it by saying that to keep it looking that way, it's taken countless volunteer hours, blood, sweat, and tears to make it look like there's been nothing done at all.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So we start almost every tour at the freight office because at the heart of this railroad, it was a freight railroad.
Yes.
It actually did very little passenger business throughout its life, even though it connected 6 communities plus in this valley here. Of course, it carried the mail, it carried baggage, and it carried people to and from their connections with the Pennsylvania Railroad, but at the core, it was a freight railroad hauling tons and tons of coal, tons and tons of raw material to the iron furnaces and all the different industries that it supported. The freight office was where it actually at one point had a wraparound big deck. The window with the awning was where the freight manager would sit and you'd come and pick up your freight. If you ordered crates of flour, milk, anything like that, this is where you'd back up your buggy or eventually your truck and you'd pick it up from here. We start our tours here because freight was the railroad's bread and butter, right? Now, visitors, passengers are the railroad's bread and butter. So in that same sense, not only is it cool to start here, because it is very aesthetically similar to what it was, but it's more of a metaphorical thing.
It's also what the railroad started with, so we might as well start here.
Exactly.
Yeah, well,
so if you wanted to go inside, there's some cool things to see.
Let's go take a look.
So the thing you have to keep in mind is that a lot of the EBT hasn't been staged for you. We've left things pretty much where we found it.
Okay.
If there was any restoration that had to take place, they took pictures of everything and tried to put it back, at least in the general area of what it was. So one of the cool things I like to point out in here, we have crates all over the place that we found. So there's stuff that's marked that it was shipped via the EBT. Some stuff we've procured to be in here that would have been here, but we've got typewriter boxes. We've got Winchester rifle box down there. Unfortunately, the Winchester rifle is not inside of it, but
single
yes. And then this is one of the most unique things over here. These are headstones that were actually purchased, carved, shipped over the railroad, and then never picked up. So they've been in here for over 100 years. This one here on the floor is for a gentleman by the name of Andrew Gamble. He was actually a Civil War veteran for the Union Army, and he's buried in the Burnt Cabin Cemetery about 20 minutes away. And after actually going there and looking, he never received a headstone. There's just straight up a rock sitting where his grave is. In his family plot, his wife has a headstone. They actually have a family obelisk with their names on it, but he himself never got a headstone. It was actually paid for by the county commissioners back in 1905, and then it was shipped here, but nobody ever came to get it. So actually this year, on either Memorial Day or Memorial Day or Veterans Day, we haven't decided which one yet, we'll be giving him his headstone back.
There's something so poignant about that.
Yes, and those are the kind of rabbit holes you go into when you work for these Broad Top that you never thought you would delve into.
No kidding.
Because the place is so interesting and incredibly intact, you are moving a crate and you go, oh, there's a Civil War veteran's headstone. And next thing you know, I'm literally planning what feels like a funeral or a service for a Civil War veteran. We found family of his who are actually going to fly out. And we have the Pennsylvania Honor Guard who are going to present the flag to his family, his relatives. Historical societies helped us find all that. We'll have a small reception, so yeah.
That's kind of incredible. Props to the railroad for honoring him in that way. I mean, that's amazing. But that, if you needed to sell me on, oh yeah, they picked things up and walked away, you have freight from right? Being as special as it is, from 1905.
That was just never picked up.
Just kicking around in the freight depot.
Right. So,
wow.
Yeah. Something you never thought you'd see. So then, once we start the tours here, we head across the tracks and go see everything else.
All right. So I see outside the freight depot we have an authentically staged Pennsylvania Railroad standard gauge boxcar.
That's right.
And 3-rail, which feels like home, but standard gauge is a long way that way.
It is. It looks a little out of place, but it's not out of place.
Okay.
And so the dual gauge display track that it's on is not original.
Okay.
The Rockhill rail yard was all narrow gauge, But up in Mount Union at the railroad's interchange with the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was a whole dual gauge yard. So there were 3 rails, and they actually had 2 standard gauge switching engines under the East Broad Top roster that would switch around the Mount Union rail yard. And there were 2 facilities up there that were really the reason why the East Broad Top was able to last as long as it did in the common carrier era. One was the coal washing plant. So when the iron furnace was shutting down, which was across the way here, they were pretty much shipping coal just straight to market. Now, a lot of their customers were online, like the brick plants in Mount Union. But of course, there was a good portion of their coal that was being sent elsewhere. And that coal, when it comes straight out of the ground, needs to be processed. Some companies buy run-of-mine coal, which is just has everything in it, the dust, the rock, the shale, all that.
All the gross,
right?
yes.
But some places just need the small lumps for their furnaces, some need bigger ones, right? So these Broad Top built a remarkably engineered facility up in Mount Union where they were able to wash coal. The narrow gauge cars would dump it into a bunker. It was shipped by conveyor belt up to the upper floors, where it was brought down, sifted, sorted, crushed into various sizes, and then it was cleaned in giant pools. And then they were able to sort it into different sizes and sell it like 6 or 7 different sizes.
That's really smart, and I'm sure that was something that kept them afloat for a long time.
Absolutely.
Because anyone who's ever dealt with coal suppliers before, when you just sort of get whatever, if you could get the perfect size of coal every time, that would be...
There's actually a really neat promotional photo that they did with about 6 Pennsylvania Railroad hopper cars sitting under the chutes. And they had all the different sizes. They had run-of-mine coal all the way to the small stoker, everything in between.
That's cool.
And we do have that in our archives, which we'll talk about the archives later, but it's a really neat photo. And then the second facility that was up there was actually a giant crane. And it was originally a timber transfer. There was a small logging operation here that served the iron furnace and other industries. Originally, iron furnaces were charcoal, not coke, for the blast furnaces. So this was all clear cut. All the hills here, everything was completely bare. And the McKelvey brothers were the logging operation. They actually ran some shays here, and they were interchanging with the railroad here. And then those flat cars were brought to Mount Union, and they had a big crane that would lift the timber off of the flat cars and put it on the standard gauge cars for market. Eventually, the logging operation fizzled out, but somebody, don't know who it was, but were incredibly creative, said, you know, we're spending a lot of time shoveling stuff out of standard gauge cars and putting it in narrow gauge cars, or we're spending a lot of time paying somebody to unload a standard gauge box car and put it in the narrow gauge box car. Why don't we just lift the standard gauge car off of its trucks, roll specially designed narrow gauge trucks underneath it that had a special bolster and a few other things to support the weight. We'll put it right behind the engine so that we can watch it, and we'll at least be able to take it from Mount Union to Rockhill, and some places even farther beyond.
Okay, so the only thing out of place with this is the fact that it still has standard gauge trucks.
That's right. This car in particular is a representation of what was here. It's the type of box car that would have come here. We have dozens of pictures of cars just like it sitting here. And yes, it is on standard gauge trucks at the moment, but we are working on transfer trucks so that we can run it on photo charters, because why not?
Because that would be awesome.
That's right. So eventually, while it's on a standard gauge display track at the moment, you'll actually be able to see what they were able to do. And there's actually a specially designed aluminum alloy knuckle adapter, because narrow gauge cars sit lower than standard gauge cars, right? The Rio Grande had idler cars with 2 different knuckles, right?
Yeah.
Here, they just had an aluminum adapter that the narrow gauge cars could hook up to.
Yeah, I guess you'd be centered still, because
That's
you're
right.
running on 3-foot gauge, so you're just doing the height at that
That's
point.
right.
Okay.
And they were lightweight because they were aluminum.
Yes, light.
That's right. We still have quite a few in the freight office. I think we've got 6. Unfortunately, they had, I think, over 100 transfer trucks, but there's only a handful that are left. So we have them here, and we're working on getting some in place.
That'll be cool.
Yeah. So, and I should also point out that there is still a bit of active dual gauge. There is active dual gauge here in the Rockhill yard. It's not original to the railroad, but our partners at the Rockhill Trolley Museum have been operating here since 1963. They were Pennsylvania's first operating trolley museum.
Okay.
And the Kowalczyk family, who purchased the railroad in 1956, they were approached by this organization and said, we want to display our cars. We bought all these cars that were historic to Pennsylvania, but we'd like to display them for the public. And he said, I'll do you one better. We'll let you restore a mile-ish of old East Broad Top right-of-way, standard gauge, and you can run your cars. So there's actually about 500 feet at least, it's more than that, but of track where standard gauge electric trolley cars and our narrow gauge East Broad Top all share it during a regular operating day.
That's really neat.
It's just random. It's not historic to these Broad Top. There was never an electric trolley car line here.
Right.
But they've been here since 1963.
It's been here for 60 years at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting piece.
That's another one of those little things of preservation where, okay, well, we've now been in preservation for so long that we've been operating like this for so long. It's kind of a part of the story.
Oh,
now.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's almost as much time as it was an operating railroad.
Right.
So,
yeah.
All right.
Amazing.
Well, let's go to the rail yard.
I have worked at several different roundhouses in my point in time, and I've worked for several different railroads, some of which that still have their roundhouse in service, but I've never seen the collection of buildings that are just, I mean, everything's here. At BNSF, we had a roundhouse and we had like one other building that was the remains of Great Northern stuff, but you guys have everything.
It's all here. And that's just a trend that continues throughout the whole thing. It's all here. It's all still here. I like to just give everybody an orientation to the rail yard because of its scale. So over on the left, you have an air brake shop and an electrical shop. You have a pattern shop and a foundry.
You guys still have the pattern shop?
Absolutely, yep. All the patterns have been moved out for security.
Right,
we wanted to store them somewhere safe. But yes, there's the pattern shop. There's a foundry. There's the blacksmith shop, the machine shop. There's a carpenter shop right behind it. There's storehouses and the stone house. There is the paint shop and then the roundhouse over here. In the 21st century, it feels like we're in the middle of nowhere. And we're very rural for Pennsylvania standards. I think those of us from the West Coast have a different definition of rural sometimes because you drive 7 hours and you're still in the state of Colorado.
Yes.
But for East Coast standards, we really are rural. And especially back in the 1870s, this was the middle of absolutely nowhere. And so that, on top of being narrow gauge, meant that these Broad Top had to be as self-sufficient as it possibly could have been.
Right.
Which is why this facility exists.
Yeah.
So the railroad's 33 miles long, right, from end to end, Mount Union to Robertsdale, that's its main line, and we're basically in the middle of it.
Okay.
And this was the widest part where they were able to put their facility, plus it was home to the Rockhill Iron and Coal Company. So it just made sense to have everything.
You're going to be doing
here.
lots of transfer operations over there. You might as well put everyone in the same place.
That's right. So the steep mountain grades, which is the reason why the railroad was narrow gauge, are actually south of here. That's where the tunnels are, big bridges, sweeping curves. We have our very own less world famous horseshoe curve. We've got a lot of railroads, beautiful mountain railroading down there. But this complex is remarkably intact. So as most places, like you said, slowly got rid of buildings and started replacing things and things fell down. Not here.
Yeah, I guess for most other railroads, the needs changed. They were standard gauge, they kept moving or they or whatever, and buildings would come and go as they needed new things.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable that some of that stuff exists. But for you guys, time stopped in the 50s.
That's right. And it stopped in the 50s, 1956. But really, the shop complex stopped evolving in about the late 20s, early 30s.
Wow.
So what was frozen in time in 1956 was pretty much frozen in time in the 1920s and 30s. And the EVT was the definition of if it's not broken, don't fix it. We're doing our thing. We have these new locomotives, 1911 through 1918. And they're working well, and we have the facilities to maintain them. So we'll just keep going as long as we can.
There you go.
So really, we start with the roundhouse.
Okay.
You'll notice there are 2 brick buildings. The rest are wood.
Yes.
And that's because of fire, right?
Yes. Yeah, brick roundhouse smart, wood roundhouse on fire.
I do believe that the paint shop burned a few times, and that's why it
is now brick.
Yes. And the roundhouse has 8 stalls and is home to 6 Mikados, 6 282 Mikados built for the railroad between 1911 and 1918.
That's incredible.
Or 1920. This is the roundhouse.
Okay.
It has 8 stalls, and they're all home to 6 narrow gauge 282 Mikados.
Okay.
And the M1, which if there was one thing that needed to be in the Smithsonian, it's this thing.
No kidding.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that operating president I was telling you about,
yes.
Siebert, he recognized that the railroad was going to grow with the coal industry.
Right.
And so as it grew with the coal industry, it needed new equipment.
Okay.
So the railroad started out, it actually had various different sizes of locomotives throughout its early life, but eventually they ended up with 6 282 Mikados that all grew in size over the period of time they were built.
Okay.
So if we go this way, you can see the size difference between 12 and 18.
Wow.
Yes. And what this really shows is just how successful the railroad was and how successful Seabrook was at reinventing the EBT for the modern era. So number 12 was, the first of these large locomotives, and number 18 was the last, and you can see the growth.
No kidding. I have all the experience with the Rio Grande stuff.
Yes.
Being out in Colorado and everything, as you do as well. And knowing the big Ks and the little Ks out in the Rio Grande territory, I wasn't sure how big these were going to be. I'd seen pictures,
Right.
I heard specifications, but you don't really know a locomotive until you get up to it and see it. And I was kind of expecting the big ones to be more like 12.
Yeah, everybody has that perception.
Yeah, but no, that's
Right.
large and in charge.
I had
mean,
always
goodness.
heard that number 18 was the largest narrow gauge locomotive at the time it was built. That was quickly surpassed
Yes.
several years later,
Yes.
but at the time it was the king of the narrow gauge rails.
Easily, and it's still got bigger drivers. So.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I didn't know that, but they all do.
Yeah.
They tried to keep things very uniform here. As best they
Everything's
could.
48 inch
That's right.
drivers.
That's right. The EBT was fiscally conservative. They had tons of ingenuity and creativity, and that's what allowed them to last as long as they did. They weren't really a lot of people have a perception of scrape by, we're going to make it happen. That's not the case.
No.
The railroad was very well run, and they had a lot of processes, and they were very good at what they did for a very long time.
You can tell that by seeing all the facilities that are here and that are still here, even up into the 50s when traffic would have been declining. Why are you keeping these facilities and taking care of them if you don't understand the exact role they take? It's not a scraping by measure or a we're going to try and cut corners measure to make everything have 48-inch drivers. It means when I order tires, I can order tires for the fleet.
That's right.
And whoever needs them gets them, and that's that.
And we still have a whole pile of them in the back. So yeah, they could have kept running this railroad for quite a while if the traffic was there.
That's amazing. How does Southern valve gear work?
It's still, yeah, right. It's basically wall shirts on its side is what Dave has described it to me as.
But this doesn't move.
Right, that's right. It doesn't move. A lot of thing that people also like to point out about these EBT engines is that the drivers are blind.
Right,
yes,
right.
And that's because of the sharp curves. Not so much on the main line. There were a lot of branches that the EBT had. The Joler branch, the Evanston branch, the Shade Gap branch, Boer. There were quite a few. The railroad actually had over 80 miles of track in its system.
But only 30.
But only 33 miles of main line.
Right.
So that's another interesting feature of these things. Honestly, I defer to you for most of the locomotive stuff because while I was a fireman, I never really went through these things in depth myself. But getting to know these over the past few years has been really interesting because there's a lot of stuff Dave finds and he just kind of scratches his head.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's restoring locomotives. You
Right.
start tearing into them and you just go, now why did they do that? Wait, what was this repair?
Right.
What happened to this thing that they had to do this?
Yeah.
All that sort of stuff happens with any locomotive on any railroad.
That's right.
But the thing that I love about these engines on the EBT is you know it's an EBT engine. You see it and it has the look. They all have the same look regardless of the size. The way the headlights mounted, the look at the front of the smoke box, the big drivers, and then with the bigger ones, the Southern valve gear,
Yes.
and they're just really cool locomotives that really uniquely identify the railroad compared to any other railroad.
All weekend I kept hearing it described as elegant. And, steam engines are industrial. They're
Yes.
big, they're noisy, they're
Yes.
loud, and there are certainly industrial engines. Like 1309 at the Western Maryland is an industrial
Yes.
engine, right? That thing looks like it's built to just kick butt and take names.
The thing is designed to
Right?
pull towns.
Yes, exactly. And versus this, where it does sort of look natural at the head end of a freight train.
Right.
I don't know. Every locomotive is different, and I enjoy that about these things.
That's what makes steam great.
Yeah. These buildings behind me were
Okay.
storehouses. So if you work over the machine shop, you constantly need bolts, nuts, screws.
Yes.
And then
A little bit of
obviously
everything.
the larger stuff, side rods and all the other stuff that you've made and you just need to store somewhere. So that's what these two buildings were. We call this one the engineer's cubby. It's where all the big stuff was. And then the other floors have just hundreds of bins of stuff, shelves and countless things, right?
Right.
We estimate that in this building alone, there was 25 tons worth of parts.
I can believe it.
Yes, and we know that it's about 25 tons because all 25 tons had to be removed from the building by hand.
Oh my goodness.
The reason why we did that was because the railroad is sitting on a marsh. It's very wet here. And over the past 60 years, as the railroad was in the tourist era, but these buildings weren't being used, there wasn't a full-time crew of people to maintain them. They slowly start sinking into the ground. They didn't have permanent foundations.
Right.
So this building, having held 25 tons worth of parts, you know, this door was about 2 feet in the ground.
Oh my god, 2
Yes,
feet.
and the whole building sagged like this. It was like a fun house inside.
Oh my goodness.
And so the Friends of East Broad Top, who's our volunteer sister organization who inherited the foundation, they've been here since the early 2000s, restoring the property and keeping the building standing. This is all a testament to them. This wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Friends.
No kidding.
This is one example of what they had to do with almost every one of these structures here. So this is before, and this is after they come in and they do their hard work.
You can really see everything that they've done, and I mean, it's beautiful, and it just looks appropriate still. It doesn't look like, oh, we made this brand new building, it's perfect in every way, and
Right.
everything's just right. It looks authentic to the railroad, but it's also sustainable now.
I promise you, you give it a whole summer of that engine going back and forth all day.
It'll be
and
blended
It
nicely.
will have the patina that the rest of these have for
Right,
sure, right?
right.
And we always joke, so there's a few of the Friends that just do windows. That's all they do. They come and they sand window frames and sills and
That's
they
a
put the
whole
panes
job
in.
itself,
Yes,
yeah.
and he knows exactly how many windows there are. I don't remember that number ever, but he knows exactly what it is. And they estimate that they've done about 50% of the windows at this point, maybe a little more.
Wow.
And we always joke that by the time they get to 100%, it'll
They'll
be
need
time
to
to
start
go back
over.
and start
Yeah,
with
yeah.
you know, and it's just a never-ending cycle.
Yeah.
So these buildings are really my call for anybody. Please come join the Friends of East Broad Top. If you're in the area, join the Friends. It's $35 a year, and you get the Timber Transfer, which is a beautiful magazine. You get a quarterly newsletter. Actually, I think it's a monthly newsletter that goes over everything happening at the railroad, very in depth. So those two things alone are worth joining, even if you can't physically come here. And of course, your dues help support all of these projects.
Right.
But then they are always looking for help. So we have a pretty robust active volunteer list that just keeps growing as the excitement for the railroad grows. So young folks, older folks,
Right.
anybody, there's always something for you to do.
Yes, this is one of the altruisms throughout preservation of railroad anything. There is so much stuff that needs to be restored and so many things that need to be preserved, and you're always fighting the battle against Mother Nature.
Right.
I'm sure, as you saw from your time in Colorado and time out here, the sun, the weather, the snow, everything is trying to return the things that we've made to the dirt, and we're trying to keep it as historical and accurate as we can.
Yeah.
And at least for us at the Colorado Railroad Museum, we have more cars than we have active volunteers.
Yeah.
And so, you try and take care of those things, and you're always outpaced.
That's right.
And so more people to help can really help something that's as important and magical as this place really is. Seeing all these structures, that's a lot to take care of. And like you were joking about with the windows, okay, by the time you get done with all the windows, well, by the time you get all the buildings sustainable and on foundations that aren't
Yeah.
going to sink, you're going to have to start over at the first building again.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's
it's
just
never
always
ending.
The paint on the windows, the siding, the paint on the buildings, there's always something to do.
Yes.
And the cool thing about the Friends, as with so many volunteer organizations, is they will teach you.
Yes.
Right? There's this perception that there's a guard of history and there's this knowledge that's locked away in a vault and it will, no. People are begging to pass their knowledge to somebody else. And this is one of those places where if you show up with work clothes on, we will put you to work during
Yes.
these work
Yeah.
sessions. They will teach you how to do what it is that we do here. If you don't really have a lot of trade skills, if they're, you don't know how to do woodworking, someone will teach you. If you don't know how to change a tie out, I promise you,
You will learn.
that you will learn. And you'll be tired at the end of the day.
Yes.
Trust me.
Yeah. Sign up. Find a place near you. East Broad Top is wonderful and amazing. Find whatever excites you near you. Sign up, volunteer, learn from the guys, and get dirty.
right.
These places exist and will only continue to exist because of volunteers, just like many of you out there who are watching this. So make sure you get involved. If you're passionate about railroading or trains or whatever you're passionate about, go out there and get involved. It'll be the most fulfilling thing you do in your life.
The best way to know what's going on at the East Broad Top is to be at the East Broad Top. The best way to know what's going on behind the scenes is to be behind the scenes.
Yes.
And it's that's it. That's where I'd leave it.
I've heard legends of the old farmhouse that ended up getting encircled with narrow gauge track.
That's right.
But I don't really know much more than that. This was here first, and then railroad happened?
There's one building here that really stands out from everything else that is in a weird angle from everything, and you can obviously tell the track had to go around it, and that's because, yes, it was the farmhouse that predated the railroad, and when it came in, just as you said, the railroad kind of was built around it and encapsulated it. It is we call it the Stone House. It was built in the mid-1790s. We know that it was renovated a little bit later in the 1870s, and then even later in the 1940s.
Oh my goodness.
And that's because it became the master mechanic's office. So downstairs was the bay window where he could see everything, all of his records, drawings, maps, things like that. That was all in here for him. We do have a shelf, a big drawer case that came out of here that's sitting in our station that'll go back once it's done with the restoration.
Amazing.
The EBT was always in the habit of putting the heaviest stuff on the top shelf, on the top floor. And that's just, again, one of those EBT-isms that you don't really know why they did that, but they did.
Sure.
And so twice, at least, we know that they had to stabilize the floor up top. And so our current staff are actually going back and doing the same thing. We had to stabilize the floor and get it ready for drywall and things like that.
Right.
But it will go back to being the master mechanic's office and a crew room for the crews in the morning.
That's wonderful. What a neat structure. And I'm so West Coast because I hear someone saying, oh, this is an old building, and then they're about to say, oh, it's from 1905 or 1850, and you said 17 something. I'm like, oh!
That's right.
Right, we're back east.
I know exactly what you mean. You drive downtown Huntington, and they're all colonial-style buildings, right? And there's forts here from the Revolutionary War.
Right.
And history out west starts much
later.
Much later in a lot of ways, unless you're going to visit, Mesa Verde or something like that, or the Spanish forts. So. And there's a lot of interesting facts with it. Another interesting fact is that there actually was a Civil War wake held here for a Union soldier who was injured in the Battle at Gettysburg. We have a lot of locals and a lot of historical societies who are just continuously researching, and they always find out more about this place every day. With the help of our archives and our archival program, but newspaper clippings, family stories, as things just turn up under a rock, you discover fun facts like that.
That's incredible.
Yeah, right here in the middle of the rail yard. So
in the middle of the rail yard.
Lots of Civil War history.
Wow.
Who knew?
Wow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's predating any of the locomotives in the roundhouse, of course, but the railroad was here and...
Well, so the railroad was actually chartered in the 1850s. That's another fun fact, is that there was an idea for the railroad far earlier than it was actually constructed. There were several charters for different railroads around here. The East Broad Top is the one that ended up being fulfilled. And it was actually, construction began in 1872. And a large reason why that construction was put on hold was due to the outbreak of the Civil War.
Right, okay. So building and the wake predates the railroad, but...
Very much so.
That's very neat.
Yes, yeah. Yep. And if upstairs, there's quite a bit of just stuff. A lot of air brake stuff. There's a lot of storage up there, and it's just one of those places where you walk into, and it really does feel like something out of Indiana Jones. It feels like you're just discovering something for the first time.
Right.
We found uniforms up there. We found a box that just had a whole bunch of uniforms from the Pioneer Trail bus route that the railroad ran.
Okay.
So those were promptly given to the archives. The Stone House actually has a cabinet inside where there were a whole bunch of time cards for employees that were filled out and that were just sitting there. I hope they got paid. Just a whole bunch of stuff that was then, our archivist, Julie Rockwell, she, I forget exactly how many bins, but it was in the hundreds of bins of stuff that we went around and collected from all these buildings, just like the Stone House, of printed papers, material,
just
documents, reports that were all just there. She consolidated, collected, and now they're preserved inside the station.
They really did just go to lunch, lock the door, and walk away.
That's pretty much the aesthetic of everything here, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. Mark, this is Brad Esposito, our
general
manager.
General manager.
And a member of our board. And he's very humble about it, but really he's been the one who's been pulling everybody together to make this happen, and also taught me most of what I know about the railroad at this point.
That's wonderful.
So we're standing in the heart of the historic shop complex, and there's no better person to tell you about it than Brad, who's been literally in the rafters.
I've worked in railroad machine shops. I've had a little bit of experience doing a couple of these things, but I've never seen a complete setup like this. I mean, Jonathan's been talking about how there's a foundry and there's a pattern shop and then the machine shop, and they were set up to do everything here, weren't they?
They're pretty self-sufficient for a small railroad, you know, and it's only 33 miles long. But if you think about it in the context of today, it's even still out of the way.
Right.
So everything that they needed, they had here.
Okay.
You know, they also supported the mine.